Luke's father picked the slaves up was at the hotel. And a researcher that worked in Oneida County researching the Underground Railroad said that there was a clear path that came from Rome and Utica into Boonville, and then on to Hough's Cave and on up to Canada through Lowell and all. Someone talked about, I don't know if it was in that, might have been in that particular article, they talked about the Fieldstone house in Lowell, which I'm sure they're talking about where Dr. Reed used to live. And then there was a house right next to him. It was another stone or brick house right next to him. And that house was also involved in the Underground Railroad. I've been told there's a house, an old house, south of the village of Martinsburg. I don't know who owns the house. It has a really old barn there, still standing. The house, I think, has been re-sided and such and looks pretty good now, but that was supposedly also a stop on the Underground Railroad. Horatio Hough himself took his wagon load of runaways beyond Lowville. Some said up near Harrisburg, in a place where you're not supposed to use that name anymore, but it was called Nigger Hollow.
That's before you get to Carthage.
Yes, yeah, but it was beyond Lowville. I mean, yeah, beyond Lowville. And that's where he took his, so that was also another station. And that was run, I can't think of his name now, but Loretta Alexander gave me an article that she found in an old newspaper, I think her cousin Rita had, that talked about the black man who lived there. And he was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. And he had married a squaw, an Indian squaw, and had children with her. And then she left and went back to the Indians, I guess, and he raised the children. But that he had a station there, and he must have moved his on north, no, through. I mean, any way they could get to Canada was where they were headed for. And as soon as they got there, they were free. Yes.
Hi, I'm Mary Reed, and the stone house, the limestone house you're referring to, we've now sold it, but my husband always told the story of the tunnel that supposedly went from that stone house to where the Rose live now. The stone house just up toward north.
Okay.
From that stone house. And he always claimed when he was growing up in Lowville, and there was once a carriage house. Where the garage is now was a carriage house. And he always said he played with, it was the Richardson house, and he played with the Richardson kids. And in the basement of the carriage house, it was boarded over. And he was always told, well, that's where the tunnel was that went up. And of course, the story is that a tunnel probably would not have, an earth tunnel would not have survived anyway, but that's always the tale that they told.
Yeah.
But I always thought perhaps where it was boarded over might have been some kind of a hiding place, and that might have explained it. But that's always the story that he had heard.
Well, it could have been a hiding place too, because that was very common, and that's like in the Collins house, they had a false wall.
Now, the Collins house you're referring to is the Collins house
In Constableville.
in Constable.
Yeah.
Then how about Denmark, going through Denmark
Oh, I'm
and the
sure.
Buckley house?
I'm sure there were more stations going all the way up, all the way up north, and I didn't follow all of them, I'm sorry. Yeah, but I know, and that would be an interesting thing if I had enough time and enough years left to actually map the whole route, from here. And it's so disappointing sometimes that, people don't pay attention to what happened here. They look everywhere else. Like this book, I was very disappointed in this book. It's the Underground Railroad in the Adirondack region. And they have a map of the Adirondack Railroad routes on a map of New York State, but you don't really see ours. And ours were there. I mean, no one pays attention to what was going on right here. And people say, well, there weren't that many people that actually came through Lewis County, and maybe there weren't a lot, but it's kind of like if you're picking up one starfish from on the beach and throwing it back in the water so it can live. It doesn't matter how many, does it? To that starfish, it's everything. So if you only had 10 or 15 slaves coming through in a season or whatever, so what? You know, that's 10 or 15 that maybe managed to get to Canada. And one other book I was going to bring along with me, which I couldn't find this morning, was a book called The Opportunity is at Hand. And it was published, I think, through the Oneida County Historical Society. And it's the story of all the African American people who served in the war, in the Civil War. And in that book, I found a character that I used in my book, who was, his name was Uncle Bob Wilson. And he was a real person, and he really did desert from the Connecticut line. Not the Connecticut line, I'm going back to the Revolutionary War for a moment here. From the Confederate lines to the Union lines. And he really didn't do that. I altered it a little bit, and I mentioned that in my book, that I did make a change because he did desert, I think, to the 117th. I'm not sure of that, but I think he did. But I made him desert to the 146th because that's where my character was serving at the Battle of Fredericksburg. And he did desert, and he stayed with the Union Army. And when the war was over, he went to live in Rome, New York. And interestingly enough, the researcher that I was working with in Rome, her husband, who was quite a bit older than her, actually knew him. And so she reviewed the book and everything, and she thought that I had pretty much written a good characterization of him. But he lived there and died in Rome, and so it was nice to see that. Anybody else have any other questions or anything, any comments? I'm sorry I don't have as much information as you might like me to have. Yes.
Do you know any more about Horatio Hough? When he died, what did he do for a living?
He was a farmer.
Did he, once he was able to, after the Civil War ended, did he ever write anything down about his helping folks to escape?
I don't think that he did. It's all written well in his obituary,
Okay.
which I'm sure it was.
What year is that?
Pardon me?
What year was his obituary?
1886, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, I have his obituary here,
Okay.
and I think probably his wife had input on it.
Okay.
And she said that he died on March 17th. No, I'm sorry, that's when he was born. He died in November 20th, 1885, but this was written in the 1886 Journal Republican. I found it online.
Okay.
And what did it say here? He became a member of the Presbyterian Church at an early age, at the time designated by the early settlers as the Great Revival. He kept up family devotions ever after his marriage, and about the last act of his life was an attempt to read the scriptures and to pray. The most noted characteristic of his life was perhaps his anti-slavery principles, in which he conscientiously opposed every act having a tendency to perpetuate slavery or assist in the recovery of fugitives. In fact, his house was one of what was then denominated underground railroad stations for the concealment of the fugitives escaping to Canada, and he lent his assistance to the extent of his ability in forwarding them toward their destination. While for a long time fearing that he should not live to see slavery abolished, when it became an accomplished fact, in the exuberance of his feelings, he thanked God that he had been permitted to live till his country was in fact, as in name, quote, the land of the free and the home of the brave, unquote. Although the liberation of the slave appeared to be the most important in his estimation, yet he contributed of his substance to other worldly objects which commended themselves to his judgment. He doesn't tell what those were. Talks about his marriage, his wife was married. He was married to his wife for nearly 53 years. Dr. Franklin B. Hough, his only brother, died the previous June, and his sister, Martha, died the week previous to his own death. And then he had one sister that survived him, Mrs. Warren Arthur. I don't know her first name. And he never stopped talking. I think he always talked about his anti-slavery feelings, but he couldn't talk about what he did. And I don't think he ever wrote it down himself. But I think this must have come from his wife or his children.
It's been dangerous for him to write it down and have somebody else get a hold of it that could have been anti.
Yes, yeah. And even after the fact, you know, it might be possible that if it could be proven that he was taking these slaves from their masters when it was illegal to do so, maybe he could have been in trouble still. So I don't imagine, not very many people talked about what they did. Jim Pitcher, the historian in Boonville, talked about slaves being transported by this one particular farmer. It just didn't sound like a happy trip to me, but with a whole load of manure on the wagon so that no one would look. But just imagine being, you know, anybody ever shoveled the gutter knows that it's full of manure and urine dripping down through the cracks. I could just visualize poor people huddled down there. It wasn't a very pleasant way to go, but it was better than going back south to be a slave. This book, if you're interested, I think it's still available on Amazon. I think that's where I got it. It's called His Promised Land, and it's written by an autobiography of John P. Parker, former slave and conductor on the Underground Railroad. And it's really an interesting story. And there's one particular story in here, I don't know if I can find it or not, it's very funny. I mean, it's hair-raising, but at the same time, it's very funny. Yeah, here it is. He's been told that, let's see if I can find the very beginning here. He was told to go down and rescue these two women, and there was supposed to be a man with them as well. But when he got down there, he couldn't find the man. But he did take the boat, and he went to the appointed place to pick up these women. And he said, at the appointed hour, I was in the boat waiting. Shortly afterwards, two figures came stealthily down the bank. One was short, the other tall, but both were unusually fat. When the girls came to me, I understood what gave them their unusual size. They had on not only their mistress's tilted hoops. One had 4 dresses, the other confessed to 3, and much underwear. What to do with these 2 stuffed figures was a problem, for when I tried to put both of them in the stern where they belonged, they filled the boat to running over with hoop skirts. I finally arranged the matter by placing one in each end of the boat. In addition to this extra clothing each, they had brought a bundle almost as large, each had brought a bundle almost as large as herself, filled with trinkets and satin slippers, another truck down to a frying pan, with which they proposed to fry their bacon on the road. Any other time I would have laughed, but serious work and dangerous work to me was at hand. I refused to carry the plunder and was about to throw it into the river when the 2 got up such a cry. I had to push off and leave it on the bank. Even then, they were broken-hearted over leaving their loot behind and were even surly to me over their loss. There was no time to lose, as I had to row 10 miles and get the girls out of sight before daylight. I rowed to the Ohio side, where I was more or less familiar, owing to my 3 nightly excursions along that shore. Just before I reached Logan's Gap, a low pass through the high hills, I heard the rhythmic beat of oars behind us. Then I knew the bundles had left behind and told their deadly story. My only safety was ashore. I made the girls take off their extra clothing and throw them in the bottom of the boat. The girl in the bow became entangled in her hoop skirts and fell overboard with a yell that echoed in the hills. When I stopped to fish the girl out of the river, I lost one of my oars, so I had to paddle ashore. We had shipped so much water in the rescue, the girls were compelled to use their mistress's fine bonnets to bail out the water. As we reached the shore, the girl in the bow leaped out, upsetting the boat, throwing me into the river. I let the skiff float off as I scrambled ashore. By this time, we could hear the frantic efforts of our pursuers distinctly, though I could not see them. At this point, while the bank was low, it was very steep. The tall girl clambered up the bank without much trouble, but the short one could not make it. She started to scream, but I slapped my hand over her mouth and threatened to strangle her, shutting her up in a hurry. Between the tall girl pulling and my pushing, we got the girl up the bank, hoop skirts and all. There was a cornfield across the bottoms, reaching to the foot of the hills. Through the cornfield, the tall girl with her hoop skirts drawn up about as high as her head went like a scared rabbit. But the short girl was in trouble again. Losing sight of us, she began to scream. This time I shut her up by telling her if she opened her mouth again, I would leave her to shift for herself. I then made her take off all her dresses except one. Reduced to her load, she was able to keep up. I just can't imagine, here you are trying to be careful and be quiet and to get away. And it's kind of like a life or death situation, and these women are really something. Anyway, if you want to read about another person's experiences as a abolitionist, those are good stories. I read another one, and I don't have that with me because I borrowed it from someone else and had to return it. But it was a very interesting story about a man who was a prince in his family in Africa. And on his 18th birthday, when they were celebrating his 18th birthday, the slave buyers came upon them. He was swimming with some friends in a river and took them all for slaves. And he eventually wrote a book about it, but it was just a very interesting book. I wish I could. It had a very long name, a long title. I can't remember now if I can find the title again. But because the name was almost French sounding, but that was his name. And he was not a slave, and never been a slave, and never thought of being a slave. Eventually, I think he did get free, and he did write a book. But it's hard to, for us sometimes to think what it was like, but if you think back, and suppose you were, an African American at that time, and you had absolutely no rights, and no one really you could turn to for any help. It's pretty scary.
Well, Harriet Tubman is buried over in
Seneca Falls.
not Seneca Falls. No,
Auburn.
Auburn.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Auburn.
We had been over to the house that she was in, and she built a house there, had one for her mother also over there.
Yeah.
I was doing defensive driving classes for one of the telephone companies that we went there. Spent a few days out there while we were doing it.
I was writing a story about Michigan, and that's when I learned about another abolitionist I had never heard of before. Her name was Laura Smith. When she was born in New York State, she was born here, and then she relocated to Michigan with her husband. Laura Smith Haviland she became, and she was a very, very strong-willed woman. She was a Quaker, and many of the Quakers were anti-slavery, but they weren't actual abolitionists because they didn't think you really ought to physically assist. You should shelter and help or whatever, but not be the one that goes and gets them and so forth. And she couldn't not do that. So she stopped being a Quaker during that period of time before the war when she needed to go and rescue slaves. And she wasn't even 5 feet tall. I actually read her autobiography, it's online. And she would just go down south if she heard about somebody, she had brought somebody up and they knew of somebody else that needed to be rescued, she would go down there herself and get them. And at one point she had a $3,000 bounty on her head. And that's a lot of money back in the early 1800s. But fortunately, she never got caught. But in Michigan, in a place called Raisin Township, she had a school. It was probably the first school in the whole country where both whites and blacks were in attendance and being taught to read and write and all of those things. And, you know, even after her husband passed away, she continued the same activity. Once the war started and she no longer needed to assist the slaves in that way, she became a Quaker again. So it was a matter of convenience to be able to do what she wanted to do, which she couldn't do as a Quaker. That's another book it's called Ellen the Slave Catcher, but that one hasn't been published yet.
Where did you find Horatio Hough's obituary?
Online, the Northern New York newspapers.
Okay.
You can go back and read, you know, newspapers from way, way back. And if you know what year you're looking for,
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
yeah. Anybody else? I don't even know what time it is.
So at Nigger Hollow, was there actually a house there that hid the slaves? I remember as a young girl always hearing about it, but never really any specific stories.
Well, that one man lived there and his family, so he had his house. I don't know, he probably also had a barn, I'm thinking.
What was this you're referring to?
Nigger Hollow,
Your house.
inside Hollow going towards it, just past Dick Bush's farm.
Yeah.
That little hollow you go down.
Yeah.
Is that the same hollow 410 strikes
No, way before that.
before that?
The Sharp Road, you pass, I think it's the Sharp Road, and it's just past that.
They said it was like 5 miles out of Longville, that.
Maybe, I mean, that's when I remember as a child, but maybe I don't have the right hollow, but that's when
It
I
could
was
be, yeah.
remembering. I mean, and I wondered because it's like, it's a creek and it's kind of a deep ravine right there. And so I wondered if they were hidden there at nighttime or something and moved to the next. I mean, like I said, I didn't really hear a lot of stories about it, but as a young girl.
Well, they would hide them.
Referred to as that.
They would hide them during the daytime
Right,
and move them at night.
right.
Yeah.
But, 'cause it's a deep.
Mr. Bush lost his job for a while as bus driver because he told one of the students that the name of that place was Nigger Hollow.
Yeah.
But then they did relent and give him back his job.
I wanted to use the term because it's historically correct, but I was told if I used the term, they would never, you know, read this book in school. So I changed it.
Was there once a story that actually was a last name of someone? And this is what I had always heard. Actually, I heard this from my husband.
No,
This may not be anything to this, but that there was a person by the name of Joe Nigger, which does sound preposterous.
well, they may
I suppose it
have
could be
been a nickname for him too, though. That's possible. But from what I saw, and I didn't bring that with me, that Loretta gave me that article from the paper about this gentleman who had the farm and or lived at Nigger Hollow. He had a name, but I can't tell you what it was because I don't remember that part. Yes.
We have wonderful things in our collection, and a couple of years ago, I came across this ledger book, which is the minutes from the church in Martinsburg, and I showed it to Sue Ansett, and she said it was the church that Horatio Huff belonged to.
Oh,
And I can't remember what she said about the ledger book, whether she was telling me the story of Horatio Huff, or she was telling me what she was reading in the thing, so you have to ask her.
yeah.
I couldn't remember what the time frame of the ledger book was, if it was 1830s, 1840s, 1850s.
Was it called the Union Church? It was called the Church of Martinsburg.
Just that she took it and she looked through it and she was making copies of certain sections. But she was saying there was some kind of trial for Horatio Huff, maybe?
Oh,
Was
no.
he kicked out?
He was kicked out of the church, and not that church, though. He was kicked out of the Presbyterian church.
Okay. Talk to Sue Ansett,
Yeah.
because she was telling me, oh, this was a significant ledger book.
Yeah, because they came, there is, I have that, and I don't think I brought that with me either, but I have well, I do have an account of that. He was, yeah, it was in this particular, it was printed in the North Country Life magazine in 1950, and it was written by the associate editor, Marjorie Hough. I don't know if she was a granddaughter, not of Horatio Hough, but of Franklin, I think. I read that somewhere. But anyway, yeah, they came to his house at night and served him with the notice that he was basically excommunicated and he was not to come back to the church.
That's 1950 edition of North Country Life?
Yes.
Is it like, what order is it? And you said this before he was kicked out for his abolitionist sentiments?
Well, yes, it says here that he was handed a resolution in February of 1842 after a full examination of the petition and resolutions presented by Brother Hough, and on mature deliberation resolved that the session and with their advice of duty and the Word of God and the interest of Christ's kingdom cannot consistently grant the petition and pass the resolutions. Brother Foote voted in the negative, all other members of the session in the affirmative. And they came to him at night, 9 o'clock, excuse me. They had another night session, and they came to him at 9 o'clock in the morning, and he was handed another note saying that by a unanimous vote declare that the charges number 1, 2, and 3, which is 1 was you have abstained from communion for more than 1 year, you have publicly in a religious meeting and renounced this church and its authority and denied your connection with it, and 3 is that you have at the same religious meeting advised and exhorted other members of this church to come out and leave the church as you have done if they fail to induce the church to take action on the subject of slavery. So they've said that he's guilty on all of those things, and therefore on motion voted unanimously that Brother Horatio Hough be and hereby is suspended from the communion of this church until he gives satisfactory evidence of penitence. And so he was basically kicked out. And he admitted all those things. He said they were true. But he didn't repent. Yeah, and this is the person, this Marjorie Hough, said that he went 4 miles beyond Lowville before directing them on to their next stop. And she talked about this being, a very commodious cave and so forth. But this is farther removed, and I think the account by Roy Damas and the accounts by Ida Damas are probably the most valid comments about it, because they were eyewitness accounts of people who were actually living at that time. And it said in an article, at the time that the cave marker was placed, there was a big article in the newspaper, and I read part of it to you, but it also said at the end of it, which I thought was kind of interesting, this was October 15th, and I think it was 1931, the assemblyman appointed a committee of 1 by the Lewis County Historical Society Tuesday night to investigate the purchase of a parcel of land at the western opening of the Hough Cave on the Damas Farm in the town of Martinsburg, and to report the findings to the society. It is a desire of the society to obtain a portion of land surrounding the mouth of the cave, which may be used for a public parking space near the cave opening, removing the fence from between the highway and the cave. And then it says in parentheses, this was never done. But this is kind of what we've been thinking about, we'd like to have happen from the Martinsburg Historical Society too, that if we could have, this, not necessarily buy a piece of the land, but have access to the land, which we've been told we could have, so that people